It was a betrayal that rocked Britain to its core, reverberating through the corridors of power and sending shockwaves across the Atlantic. 5 men, Harold Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald McLean, John Cairncross, and Anthony Blunt, would become known as the Cambridge Five, a name that would become synonymous with one of the most notorious spy rings in all of history. Born into privilege and educated among the British elite, these men were destined for prominent roles in the nation's most powerful institutions. Yet between 1940 and 1951, they embarked on a path that would see them penetrate the highest levels of British intelligence and government. In a web of deception and intrigue, they covertly funneled Britain's most closely guarded secrets to the Soviet Union. To the KGB, they were invaluable assets, codenamed the Magnificent Five, delivering intelligence that reached the Kremlin and influenced global events. Even now, decades on, the true extent of their espionage activity remains the subject of popular scrutiny and popular representation. Questions such as what drove them to betray their country and how they managed to elude detection for so long remain as complex as the men themselves. This is the story of the Cambridge Five. Just 60 miles from London stands Cambridge University, founded in 1209 by John Grimm. It stands as a symbol of academic prestige and social refinement. In the early 1930s, its halls were filled with the nation's brightest young minds, drawn from the most privileged of families, eager to secure their place in Britain's upper echelons. Amongst these scholars were the future members of the Cambridge Five. Immersed in a whirl of intellectual rigour, they were also drawn into the era's political currents. As many should know, university life was not just about academic success, but it was also about exploring new ideas, often radical ones, in a world on the brink of change. Donald McLean, the son of a distinguished diplomat, and Kim Philby, whose father was a noted Arab scholar, were groomed for a career in public service. John Cairncross, from a more modest background, excelled as a linguist with a mind that set him apart. Guy Burgess, known for his sharp wit and flamboyant personality, was also a close friend of Philby and a fixture in Cambridge's social scene. And Anthony Blunt, son to a prominent clergy family. As these young men pursued their studies, the world outside was gripped by crisis. The Great Depression had ravaged British society, and fascism was on the rise across Europe. The students of Cambridge Five witnessed these events, began to question whether capitalism and democracy could meet the challenges of the time. In the atmosphere of uncertainty, communism began to attract interest as possible solutions to the world's ills. The ideology promised a way to address the deep inequalities that they saw around them, offering an alternative to the failures of the systems of the West. At Cambridge, a young professor named Arnold Deutsch played a key role in shaping the political views of these impressionable minds. Few knew that Deutsch was more than just an academic. He was a social. At Cambridge, a young professor named Arnold Deutsch played a key role in shaping the political views of these impressionable minds. Few knew that Deutsch was more than just an academic. He was a Soviet agent, adept at identifying and recruiting those who shared his revolutionary ideals. During their breaks from Cambridge, the young men travelled through Europe, where they encountered firsthand the political upheaval and radical ideas that would deeply influence their beliefs. In places like Vienna, where political activism and social rebellion were intertwined, they found a philosophy that resonated with their growing disillusionment. Beyond their political awakening, the Cambridge Five were also pushing the boundaries of social norms. Burgess and Anthony Blunt were openly gay in a time where the sexuality was illegal, whilst Donald McLean himself identified as a bisexual. Filmby and Cairncross, though involved in more traditional relationships, were equally driven by a sense of rebellion against the status quo. Cambridge provided more than just an education. It was a place where lifelong connections were made. These networks would later help the Cambridge Five ascend to positions of influence within British society, but they also made them valuable targets for Soviet recruitment. With the rise of dictators in Europe, the urgency to act became a driving force for these young men. Soviet recruiters like Deutsch tapped into their sense of urgency, framing their mission as a fight for peace. A call that the Cambridge Five was all too ready to hear. The offer was not to betray their country, but to join a global struggle for peace and for justice. By the time they graduated, around 1937, the members of the Cambridge Five were no longer just students. They were committed to a cause that would lead them into the world of espionage, setting the stage for one of the most infamous spy rings in all of history. In 1937, the turbulence of the Spanish Civil War became the stage for the next act in the saga of the Cambridge Five. Kim Philby, working under the guise of a journalist, arrived in Spain where Francisco Franco, a nationalist general, was locked in a bloody struggle to seize control from the Republican forces. For Stalin, Franco represented a potential danger, leading to a covert order for his assassination. The mission would ultimately fall into Philby's hands. But in the heart of a war zone, how could a journalist like Philby get close enough to carry out such a dangerous assignment? It was a question that seemed almost impossible to answer, until fate was to intervene. During a routine trip to the front, a Republican shell exploded near Philby's car, wounding his fellow passengers. Philby, though injured, survived. This close call unexpectedly transformed him into a hero among Franco's forces, a twist of fate that would prove invaluable. In an ironic turn of events, the very man Stalin wanted dead, Franco, ended up awarding Philby a medal for bravery. Yet the capricious nature of Stalin's decisions would soon redirect Philby's mission, sparing Franco and allowing Philby to continue his undercover work. Little did Philby and the Cambridge Five know that the coming global conflict would catapult them into a world that would grant them unfettered access to some of Britain's greatest military secrets. And indeed, all of this information would find its hands with the Soviets. Back in London, as Philby gained influence abroad, the other members of the Cambridge Five began to position themselves closer to the corridors of British power. Guy Burgess found his way into the world of radio, where his access to influential figures grew with each passing day. Burgess was this brilliant and charming character with a talent for making connections in the most unlikely of places. His role at the BBC put him in contact with some of Britain's most powerful leaders. He was also a prominent homosexual, which allowed him to garner relations throughout London's popular scene. And finally, as a man in espionage, no one suspected him due to his elaborate and flamboyant lifestyle. Next, Donald McLean gained a role in the Foreign Office, granting him access to critical diplomatic communications, including those involved with Britain's wartime allies. These documents, many of them classified as top secret, were precisely what the Soviet intelligence needed to stay ahead of the curve. With McLean gathering intelligence from the Foreign Office and Burgess acting as the linchpin in a network of influential contacts, The Cambridge Five's reach extended into the very heart of the British war effort. But it was Kim Philby who would secure the ultimate prize for the Soviet Union, a key role within the MI6, Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service. In 1946, Stuart Menzies, the head of MI6, places Philby in charge of Section 9, a division newly created to oversee operations against the Soviet Union. What Menzies hadn't accounted for was that he had just handed control of Britain's anti-Soviet intelligence, the greatest Soviet spy in all of history. It was the perfect cover. Philby was in a position to see every operation MI6 launched against the Soviet Union. He knew the identities of agents, the strategies employed, and the timing of each mission, and every piece of it went straight back to Moscow. One of the most devastating examples of Philby's betrayal was the Albanian mission. Designed as a covert operation to destabilize the communist regime, the mission was doomed from the start. Philby had tipped off the Soviets, who alerted the Albanian government. The commandos, expecting to liberate their homeland, were instead captured or killed upon arrival. The destruction of the Albanian mission was just one example of how deeply Philby's treachery would compromise British intelligence. But it wasn't just Philby. John Cairncross, the fifth member of the Cambridge Five, was about to deliver one of the most critical blows to the Allied war effort. In 1941, Cairncross was assigned to Bletchley Park, where he had access to the most closely guarded secrets of the war, the ultra-decrypts. These were intercepted German communications, decrypted by the brilliant minds of Bletchley, which provided the Allies with vital intelligence on enemy movements. Cairncross passed on these ultra-decrypts to the Soviet handlers, providing them with invaluable insights into German military strategies, particularly on the Eastern Front. This intelligence played a crucial role in the Soviet Union's ability to withstand and eventually repel the German invasion. As the world transitioned from the chaos of war to the uneasy tension of the Cold War, the Cambridge Five found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. They had begun as idealists, fighting fascism by any means necessary. But now, fascism was dead, and they were spies in a world where yesterday's ally had become today's enemy. Their actions, once cloaked in the justification of peace, were now seen through the lens of betrayal. And the British intelligence service weren't blind to the threat within anymore. Beginning to sense the danger lurking in their midst, the clock was well and truly ticking on the Cambridge Five, and their days of espionage were numbered. By 1950, Kim Philby and Guy Burgess were stationed in Washington, D.C., each in positions of significant influence. Philby, representing MI6, and Burgess, despite his deteriorating health and behaviour, were both able to play pivotal roles in the Cold War intelligence game. Meanwhile, Donald McLean, who had previously served in Washington, was now leading the American division of the British Foreign Office. Despite his increasingly erratic behaviour, he was promoted rather than reassigned. Whilst McLean's erratic behaviour was clearly noted, it was not acted upon. His high level and deep connections made him too valuable to dismiss, even as his mental state deteriorated. The Cambridge Five, operating with such secrecy for nearly a decade, were on the verge of exposure. The Venona Project, a top-secret American initiative, aimed to crack Soviet codes and reveal the identity of Soviet spies. This was a critical turning point in the unravelling of the Cambridge Five's network. By 1944, as the Cold War had begun to heat up, American intelligence had begun to prioritise decoding intercepted Soviet communications. The Venona Project was pivotal in revealing important clues about Soviet espionage activities. The Venona Project uncovered encrypted Soviet messages that hinted at a major leak within the British Embassy. This led to the identification of a key Soviet agent, including one codenamed Homer, who would later be confirmed to be Donald McLean. Recognising the threat posed by their compromised identities, Philby and Burgess had to act swiftly. The plan to warn McLean was a desperate measure, carried out under the guise of Burgess' disgraceful return to London. There's debate about whether the plan to recall Burgess was truly meant to warn McLean. Some argue it was a clever ruse, whilst others believe it was a genuine attempt to save their friend from impending discovery. Regardless of the intent, Burgess's return allowed him to inform McLean of the impending investigation. Realising that McLean could not escape alone, Burgess assisted in arranging his defection. McLean's escape involved a daring journey across the Channel. Burgess, accompanying him, ensured their passage through France and ultimately into the Soviet Union. The defection of McLean and Burgess shocked both British and American intelligence. While McLean's unstable condition made him a liability, Burgess's decision to assist in the escape was unexpected and unplanned. When Philby learned of McLean's defection, he was dismayed to discover that Burgess had joined him. The plan had been to save McLean alone, but Burgess had involved himself, which added to the chaos. Philby's reaction was one of horror and of frustration. The defection of Burgess was not part of the plan, complicating an already precarious situation. The unravelling of the Cambridge Five intensified as MI5 worked to uncover the extent of their espionage. Despite extensive investigations, some elements remained shrouded in secrecy. Philby's luck momentarily saved him. Thanks to parliamentary intervention, he was publicly exonerated, allowing him to continue his career under a new guise as a journalist in Beirut. However, by 1962, Philby's cover was blown. Confronted by the MI5, he admitted to his espionage, but disappeared before his arrest could be carried out. Philby's escape to Moscow was dramatic, but his reception there was less than triumphant. The KGB, wary of his past, offered him a more subdued welcome. In Moscow, Philby faced a reality far from the heroic image he had envisaged. He was given a modest apartment and minimal respect, struggling with the KGB's distrust and his own disillusionment. Philby's arrival in Moscow was met with indifference, despite his high-profile status in the West. The KGB treated him as a lesser figure, which was a bitter pill for Philby to swallow. Donald McLean, Burgess and Philby, once celebrated as the pinnacle of Soviet espionage, found themselves in environments of repression and distrust. Their ideological zeal had brought them to a grim and unfulfilled end. While the names of Kim Philby, Guy Burgess and Donald McLean had been revealed to the public amidst scandal and outrage, the story of the Cambridge Five was far from over. The two other members of the Cambridge Five remained at large, John Cairncross and Anthony Blunt. They would continue to evade exposure for years, their secret hidden in plain sight. John Cairncross, often considered the most elusive of the five, was a man of remarkable intellect, a gifted linguist and scholar. He held positions within Treasury, the Foreign Office and Intelligence Service, each role providing him with access to sensitive information. But it wasn't until 1964, well after the other members of the ring had been exposed, that Cairncross finally admitted his involvement with the Soviets. His confession, however, was kept secret by the British government for over a decade, sparing him the public humiliation that had befallen his fellow spies. Anthony Blunt, the final piece of the puzzle, led a double life that was perhaps the most shocking of all. As an art historian and the surveyor of the Queen's pictures, Blunt moved in the highest circles of British society. By day, he curated royal collections. By night, he was passing secrets to the KGB. Blunt's exposure in 1979 sent shockwaves through Britain. The revelations that a knighted scholar, a trusted figure within the royal household, was a Soviet spy was met with disbelief and outrage. It was Margaret Thatcher who confirmed the shocking truth, stripping Blunt of his knighthood and thrusting the story of the Cambridge Five back into the spotlight. With the unmasking of Cairncross and Blunt, the full extent of the Cambridge Five's treachery came into focus. Their ability to infiltrate the very heart of British institutions and operate undetected for so long underscored the extraordinary nature of their espionage activities. But the story of the Cambridge Five doesn't end with their exposure. Their tale of betrayal and espionage has permeated popular culture, leaving a legacy that extends beyond the Cold War. The Cambridge Five didn't just alter the course of history. Their betrayal left an indelible mark on popular culture and the collective imagination. Their story, a heady mix of privilege, betrayal, and ultimately espionage, has fascinated and inspired countless works of fiction, film, and television, transforming them into enduring icons of the Cold War. The legacy of the Cambridge Five serves as a stark reminder of the perils of espionage, the complexities of ideology, and the ever-present risk of betrayal. Their story remains one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of Cold War espionage.